Hi, I'm Christian D. Reed. This is Crowland Publishing, and welcome to the first of our subgenres discussions with Hyborian Age Fantasy. Well, before we begin, I definitely have something terribly wrong with me. I'm not feeling very well, so I'm not going to be on camera on this particular one. Trust me, you do not need to see the living collection of ticks and inhuman-colored skin that is me right now. So it's just pictures of like muscular barbarians. So if you have this and while you're doing something else, you're not going to miss any sort of face pulling or any amusing physical comedy. So anyway, Hyborian Fantasy. It's named after what Robert Howard called his stories, his Conan stories, a sort of invented and hallucinated pre-cataclysm and a pre-Atlantis falling Bronze Age world. It's this amalgamation of stuff that happened in what we would think of as the very distant past. Now, sometimes it is actually something that takes place in the very distant future as well. It's very post-apocalyptic, but the idea is that you live in this world that is brutal, where the central clash is between civilization and barbarity, and civilization isn't necessarily the good guy. Which one is good? Neither, really. But the texts tend to be sympathetic towards barbarism. Conan is forever being depicted as honest and plain dealing and strong and powerful because he's not held back by the decadent and weak laws of civilization and the lies of people who live and work in, lawful societies. There's, if it's sounding a little bit politically dicey, well, it kind of is, and don't read about Robert Howard's personal politics, whatever you do. Although, ironically enough, the key to the Hyborian Age settings is to think of them as existing in a pre-classical world, and like it had existed in the pre-classical world on Earth, there is a huge emphasis on multiculturalism. These are stories about nations that rub up against each other, that touch each other, that are scenarios that happen when a whole bunch of different races, species, nations, cultures and societies rub together. Sometimes there's conflict, of course there is, and sometimes there's just people getting on with their lives. It's not unusual to see an Indian guy and an African guy and an Asian guy in a Conan story. They might be called something different, but it's obviously them. And Conan is forever hanging out in port cities and trading towns and places that are clearly Alexandrian and Samarkand and along the old Silk Road, places where, as we've always seen throughout history, just people from Egypt to Greece to India came together and traded and talked and married and shared songs and food and stories with each other. So when you're talking about Hyborian Fantasy, you must, if you were serious about recreating the tropes, really create a multicultural and interesting world with lots and lots of different kinds of people to meet and talk to. So aside from that multiculturalism, the other big themes of Hyborian Fantasy are passion, emotions, lust, anger, love, desire, possession. It's really about feelings. It's about, I want that. Nothing can stop me from having it. It is my overwhelming desire to have the eye of the serpent, to have the king's daughter. You will risk anything to have these things. You will do anything you can to slake your desires. That is a huge part of Hyborian Fantasy. Conan is over and over moved by his whims. Another thing is that civilization is always to be distrusted, and the people who live in civilization are somehow morally behind barbarians. Laws and soft clothes are always decadent. Philosophy is something that happens to you when you've fought with a blade, when you've axed a monster. That's philosophy. That's the truth of the world. And how can you trust the philosophies taught by soft weirdos or decadent perverts, which is what ultimately civilization hides? Now, the wilds are places of great danger, and the wilderness should be the emphasis on any Hyborian Fantasy campaign, because it is about the power of the environment. Hyborian Fantasy is a fantasy in which the environment is the greatest enemy of all. The landscape is vast and intimidating and dangerous. You don't just go into the desert, you go into the howling, windswept hotness where the wind strips flesh from the bones. You go into the cold deserts where the ground is like stone and vast canyons hold dark secrets. You travel to icy wastes where the cold can kill in an instant. You travel up vast mountains where avalanches race down, destroying all in its path. This is a primal world that civilization cannot as yet touch. And it wants to kill you, and it is prowling with the monstrous. Also, there's also gorillas everywhere. It's such a weird trope, but Hyborian Fantasy loves gorillas everywhere. So what PCs do you make up in a Hyborian Fantasy? Well, in the Conan stories, Conan is basically a really strong example of the kind of fictional character that would really become the primary model for all PCs for the last 45 years. This is the very, very roots of D&D gaming. Gary Gygax and all his mates, they weren't such big fans of Lord of the Rings, but they were big fans of the pulpy American Carl Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard stuff. Conan himself, the primal adventurer. He is a huge and mighty man of great moods. He can be angry and violent and lusty. He can be of good humour. He's surprisingly smart. He does not trust city people, or at least it's very hard for city people to win his trust. His instinct is everything. His word is everything. And while a lot of people think that he's stupid, he is most certainly not. He speaks dozens of languages. He is very, very crafty because you have to be. He does not much respect book learning, but in his world, how useful is it to know a law when a bloody giant white ape is about to eat your bloody brains? Another Hyborian Age hero is Bran MacMorn, the last Pict. He is very much living in the darkness of the classical world. He is a character who exists to keep Rome from destroying his people and his civilization. And he is a much more sort of philosophical character than Conan, but nevertheless, he is still very much in that category of civilization will destroy us. We must fight it off. Red Sonja, famous spin-off character. She is motivated by a goddess originally who trains her. And then there's some other... yeah, again, a lot of this stuff hasn't aged that well. Xena, from recent times, she is close to Hyborian Fantasy, even though she's sort of after Atlantis, if Atlantis even comes into Xena. And best of all is Jurel of Joiry, who was an attempt to really, even in the 1930s, combat the sexism of the genre. And Jurel is smart, and Jurel is not a butch, big, fighty lady who needs to strangle everything. She is much more crafty and clever. I would say that He-Man from Masters of the Universe is a good example of a barbarian, especially those early little booklets that you could get. Thunder, which was a ASOL cartoon from the 80s. I'm sure it's terrible if you watch it as an adult, but I remember really, really liking it. He's in a post-apocalyptic world. Wizards, clerics, sorcerers, all that much more primitive, much less about books and study and research than I call upon the spirits of my ancestors. Really go for the witch doctor, go for the shaman, go for characters like that as inspirations. Of course, Mako from Conan the Barbarian, the film, absolutely perfect. So what kind of adventures do you go on in Hyborian Fantasy? Well, good news is there is a robust and very, very large and occasionally bloody great canon of Hyborian Fantasy short stories and novels to draw on. Look at the original Conan stories, the Teeth of Gwaihir. They're a rare prize. So Conan and his mates have to go and find a weird old mummy who tells them where to go. And then they run across a rival adventuring crew who are after the same treasure. And at the end, Conan saves his mate rather than get the treasure. Fun story. And I think the most basic setup for a D&D adventure that there is. In another story, beyond the Black River, Conan saves a guy called Balthus from a swamp devil, and they team up to take on an invading sorcerer with the fantastic name of Zogar Sag. And eventually Zogar takes the form of a big monster, but Conan's mighty body defeats it handily. So there you go, an invasion into a small township or village by an evil sorcerer. Classic. In another story, Conan is provoked by a naked lady, because few ladies wear pants in these stories, into chasing her around because he wants some sexy times with her, but oh no, it's a trap, and it turns out she's mates with frost giants and they try to kill his ass, but he's Conan, so you know how that works out. The Elric stories, which I've talked about before. Elric is not a barbarian, but nevertheless he is in a Hyborian era world. Great story, a particular favourite of mine. He's hired by a woman who turns out to be from a lost race who have wings, and her wings have been taken from her. So she needs an ancient book of spells to return them, and Elric decides to take the job. Alright, but guess what? The Dark Gods are involved in this decision, and again, Dark Gods are a fantastic villain for a Hyborian campaign. Now there are loads and loads of books and stories and movies and all the rest of it that are going to directly inspire your adventures in a Hyborian campaign. We'll get to them, but I think that the most important thing to remember is that these PCs are not necessarily going to be moved by the same things that other PCs in other worlds are. They're going to be all about instant gratification. They're going to be about following their passions. So the setup to an adventure is pretty irrelevant. Go steal the eye from the elephant god. Easy. And then it's about how they respond to each other and how they respond to the challenges on the way. That's the adventure, the passion, the drive. That's what motivates Hyborian PCs. So those are the adventures. What are the monsters? Now, Hyborian Fantasy is not really Mythic Europe. It's a weird pre-classical era, so you don't have a lot of the folkloric monsters like dragons and goblins that appear in normal D&D. The subgenre loves cults. Really, really big into cults. Weird mutants as well. Like I said, apes. But animals as well. And this is a part of the environment as the enemy. Animals. People are always punching out tigers and sharks in these stories. So use giant animals, awakened animals, pseudo-natural animals. Ancient bound demons lurking in huge cyclopean ruins, witches and abandoned shacks, familiars and elementals who serve the ancient sorcerers, leeches and spiders and mosquitoes kind of grotesque. Make them huge, make them vast, make them hybrid, make them disgusting. If you're using undead, they tend to be one-offs, death knights and liches, undead threats from the ancient past in the ancient past, and sometimes, but not often, Lovecraftian god creatures with names like Yashamahajal, weird alien gods. In fact, that notion of beyond the stars is something that's a little bit unique to the early fantasy stories of Hyborian era stuff. The idea that alien life is real and a valid enemy, because the notions of what was science fiction and what was fantasy wasn't quite set yet. I should do a video on that one day. So, other planets, invaders from other worlds, weird things. I wouldn't use straight spaceships, but meteors that crash and out come strange things. And the other great monster of Hyborian fantasies is the ancient pre-human race from the dawn of time. Serpent men, the devil kingdoms, in D&D terms, Wanti, tieflings. These races that are genuine opposition to human dominance of the planet. They are great, great Hyborian era bad guys. Now, specific to D&D and to RPGs, you've got two big problems with Hyborian fantasy: low magic and low technology. Low technology is important. It's a feature of the genre, so no plate mail, no crossbows. Generally speaking, nothing of the Iron Age. And this also means, with low magic, little healing or war magic. Be aware of that before you plan out these kinds of campaigns. Magic PC should be rare, therefore. Now, I don't like to say these classes are banned, but I do like to make players work to justify their class. So if they want to be a wizard, maybe you insist that they're a weird tribal shaman. If they're a warlock, maybe they're an apprentice to a 5,000-year-old devil sorcerer. Make a cleric rare. Maybe they're the only cleric. A weird holy figure. Make the druid an eerie shapeshifter. Now the good news is that 5e, well at least D&D, has a really, really good take on Hyborian Fantasy, and that is Dark Sun. Itself, it's set after a cataclysm. It's basically Mad Max fantasy world. And it has a great take on rules that can really, really emulate this sort of genre. Now, I don't think, in fact, I know that there is no official Dark Sun for 5e, but I just typed, Dark Sun 5e into the Google machine and it just exploded with fan stuff. So I highly recommend that instead of sort of starting from scratch with this sort of conversion, that you just go there, Dark Sun 5e. And if you are more old school Renaissance kind of a cat, Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea and the Barbarians of Lemuria are both old school D&D games. Huge lot of inspiration there. Great stuff. So you don't have to do a whole lot of work yourself if you're going to recreate this kind of genre. So, alright, you've listened to this video. Maybe you're interested in doing this kind of a fantasy campaign. What are the inspirations? Well, obviously the Conan stories. First stop, best stop. They are the granddad. The Kane stories by Carl Edward Wagner. Fafford and the Grey Mouser for a slightly more sophisticated take. And funny too. The Mighty Berserk comics, although, they're dark. A fun diversion, a different kind of barbarian fantasy, is Gentleman of the Road by Michael Chabon. Thongor. Yes, Thongor by Lynn Carter. Yeah, okay. And the good news is that if you haven't watched a lot of fantasy film from the 70s and the 80s, golly, you're in for a fun time. I would highly recommend that you start with Conan the Barbarian because it's a legitimately really fun and good film. And I absolutely legit love it. But there's also Italian sword and sorcery films, and I would highly recommend Ator the Fighting Eagle, Beastmaster, Deathstalker. I'll be honest, don't watch this with kids in the room. They're pretty exploitative films, but they're in the genre. There are fantastic video games like Golden Axe and Diablo you can play. There's just so much to draw from. So get stuck in, cut your bloody swathe through Samaria, overthrow the topless towers of whatever. Go for it. Feast, drink, war. Hyborian Fantasy is a load of fun. Give us a like, give us a share, give us a subscribe, tell your mates if you like this series, and we'll be back with Medieval Fantasy. See you later.